Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Sacha Black. Hey, Sacha, how are you doing?
Hello, thank you for having me.
I am pleased to have you here. To give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Sacha Black is a best-selling and competition-winning author, rebel podcaster, and professional speaker. She writes educational nonfiction books for writers and sapphic books for young adults. She also writes under a super secret pen name. She has five obsessions.
Not so secret anymore.
Oh, not so secret anymore. Oh, do
Not
tell.
so secret anymore. Yeah, so the pen name is Ruby Rowe, and I decided in February to come out with that pen name. So yeah, the pen name's Ruby Rowe.
Oh, cool. Well, you didn't hear it here first, but you heard it. Oh, and on top of that, she has 5 obsessions: words, expensive shoes, conspiracy theories, self-improvement, and breaking the rules. And she lives in Cambridgeshire, England, with her wife and genius giant of a son. And I invited Sacha on the podcast, back to the podcast, to talk about The Anatomy of a Bestseller, one of the books that she has written, the nonfiction educational books for authors. And I thought this was very interesting because I think a lot of people, based on that title, would expect it to say, like, how to run Facebook ads. But you take a very different approach, a very much more like craft-oriented approach. So can you talk about like what you saw going on that made you feel like a craft-oriented approach toward The Anatomy of Bestseller was going to be helpful for your fellow authors?
Yeah, because everybody talks about writing to market. Like that is sort of the big catchphrase of indie authors. We all write to market or as to market as we can. And when everybody talks about that, what they do is they talk about the advertising, they talk about the pitch and the brand and, assessing the market and trying to find things that will sell. What they never do is actually talk about the writing of writing to market. And so what I wanted to do with the book was to introduce the concept of, okay, well, how do I deconstruct what bestsellers are doing? How do I work out why they're successful or why they're selling? And so that was kind of the foundation of the book, combined with a conversation that I'd sort of had with patrons where I had thought that everybody deconstructed the books that they were reading and was shocked and flabbergasted to find out that they didn't, in fact, do that. And so one of my amazing patrons has a design company called Booklitical Designs. And so she thrust a cover at me and was like, here's the cover, now you have to write the book. And so I did. And that's I wrote the book. And that's who it's dedicated to, in fact. It's dedicated to Cassie. But yeah, so that's kind of where it came from. And I think the reason, I don't know. I don't know how much like your listeners know about Clifton Strengths, but I'm #1 competition. And so it's very natural for me to look at the market and do this kind of subconscious deconstruction in order to understand like where to pitch myself, like what's working, like just have a very comprehensive understanding of the market. And so because I knew that there were lots of books already on marketing, I wanted to take the craft side because that's where my passion is anyway.
Yeah. Well, I'm not positive this is related to our primary topic, which is The Anatomy of a Bestseller, but could you just talk a little bit about what the experience was like to write to cover? We've been like be given the cover and then like have an assignment in essence.
Yeah, well, I mean, so obviously I was allowed to change the title, but yeah, it was, it was, some of the sections were so easy to write and other sections were so unbelievably difficult because what I had to do was make conscious a process that was very subconscious for me. Like I naturally deconstructed books. I naturally deconstructed the market. I naturally searched for holes in the market. And, I naturally understood how to find comp authors and comp writers and comp voices and all of the rest of it. And so I had spent a very long time taking that for granted. So the chapters where I kind of had to explain my process and reasoning were quite difficult. But then there were other chapters like deconstructing a sentence and pulling out the tools that became very easy to me because that was a very like practical task that I could say, I do this, then I do this, then I do this. But yeah, some of that mindset stuff and that ability to know what to look for was so difficult to explain because I was just like, well, I just know.
Yeah.
So if like writing the book to the cover was an odd experience, but I loved it. So yeah.
That is very cool. I can imagine people doing that for themselves. Maybe they don't get an assignment from a fan, but maybe they create their own cover and then maybe it's not the cover it gets published under, but they create their own it's like an inspirational thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, everyone should. I mean, I definitely used to do that, like before I would, because I can't do any cover design, but I would mock up, basic ones in Canva just as like motivation.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I do want to turn more explicitly now to the anatomy of a bestseller. And you had broken out the sections into 3: read, deconstruct, and implement. And I just picked out a couple of things that struck my interest, struck my fancy as I was reading through them. And we can take this conversation wherever it seems useful. But talk a little bit in the read section about the idea of reading like a writer and why people might be resistant to doing that.
Okay, so I should probably explain what reading like a writer means first, and then I'll sort of answer the question. So my definition of reading like a writer is that really there are 2 types of reading like a reader and then reading like a writer. And so when you read like a reader, it's the escapism, it's the what of what is going on in the story. You're very concerned with, the plot and the journey that you're being taken on. Of course, you're, concerned with characters as well. But broadly speaking, your focus is on what is going on, what's everybody feeling. When we were at school, and I don't know what your sort of English lit classes were like, but my English teachers were very concerned with why. That sort of question of like, why did the author do this? What was the meaning behind it? And I kind of wrap that up in reading like a reader, because sometimes we'll all go, oh, like that was so poignant, or, whatever. But reading like a writer goes deeper than that, like a lot deeper than that. So we do those 2 base layers, but then we also need to understand the how. So how has the author created the effect they've created? How have they developed that characterization? How have they conveyed that emotion? What are the tools they're using? Like, why is that effective? Why is something else less effective? And so that is what reading like a writer is in essence. But so I think there's probably a couple of reasons why people are resistant to doing it. The first one is that reading is always the number one hobby. If you look across the world and, you look at statistics, that it always says reading is like our number one leisurely activity. And so nobody wants reading to be ruined, right? And so I think a lot of people fear that it will detract from their love of reading. And I think the second reason, which let me just say does not, because I love it even more, because I get to understand like the what, the why, and the how.
Can I just jump in there for a second?
Yeah.
Do you ever have the experience or recommend to people that they read it twice? So I can see that for myself. Oftentimes I read like a reader and just kind of let it wash over me. But then I want to go back and do a more analytical read, because then I feel like I'm kind of getting the best of both worlds. I'm getting just the immersive experience and then the more analytical experience.
Absolutely. So I think it depends on, so I kind of relate this to being a plotter or a pantser, but in terms of how you read. So for me, I don't reread. And so I have to do the analysis up front. But if there are a huge swathe of people who love rereading. And so for them, they can do that kind of read, get an understanding of the story, and then go deeper on the second read. So yeah, there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just that for me, I cannot stand rereading anything. And so, yeah, for me, I do it up front, which is why I have to pick and choose what I do this for. Because obviously, if I want to read for escapism, then I can't do the analysis because, it's a different depth of reading. It's a different pace of reading. So, yeah, I do pick and choose. And that's the point. We don't have to read this way all of the time. We can read it when we want to learn something, or if there's something we want to develop in our own craft. This isn't prescriptive. I'm not saying everybody needs to read like this all of the time. So yeah, so the second reason that people are resistant to it is because it does skirt too close to comparison. That said, I think there are 2 ways to look at comparison. And some of this, admittedly, is because I am number one competition. So for me, comparison is my frame of reference. It's how I understand my position. I understand where I am compared to others. So for me, comparison isn't a negative kind of exercise. It's actually very generative, because I'll see, okay, well, I'm here, but I want to be here. And therefore that generates motivation in me to get there. For the vast population of writers, that isn't the case, which is exactly why I talk about this in the book. So for a lot of writers, comparison is fear-based and it leads to comparisonitis. So what happens is they'll go, oh, well, what if I'm not good enough? What if I can never get there? What if I can't write like that? And so you get all of these fear-based what ifs, and the comparison becomes very negative, and like it prevents action instead of creating it. My argument is that when you do this reading like a writer, you do what I call constructive comparison. So instead of, and it's just like how we get used to beta reader feedback, right? It's constructive feedback as opposed to critical feedback. And that's exactly what this is. It's constructive comparison. So you are comparing for a purpose rather than just comparing like significance, which is what often this fear-based stuff is. Oh, I'm not as good as, I'm not as important as. And so essentially, this type of comparison is comparison for learning or for analyticalness. And what you're doing is not assigning emotion. You're not looking at, oh, that author's done something better or worse than me. You're just looking at the differences and the similarities. What do they do that I also do? Oh, look, they use juxtapositions. I do that too. Cool. Do I like how they've used the juxtaposition? Oh, no, actually, I prefer how I do it. Okay, well, that's information that tells you something about your voice and your style. And that helps you make these decisions about the voice that you want to create in your craft and in your books. And so, yeah, it's less about assigning emotion to it and more looking very objectively at what are the tools these authors are using, and would I like to use those tools and create similar effects in my own work? Or actually, am I looking at it and going, I would never do that in my work? Yeah, because that tells you information as well. So, yeah.
When we're doing this, do you ever have to, in your own comparison reading, intentionally guard against just adopting the style of other writers? Like, I know a lot of writers can't read certain other writers while they're writing because they find themselves subconsciously mimicking the style of someone else. Is that a caution or a red flag one has to watch out for?
I don't think so. Like mimicry gets a really bad rep, but even Neil Gaiman in the masterclass, he had this great quote that said, most of us find our own voices only after we sounded like a lot of other people, which I absolutely love that quote. And if you look at like evolutionarily speaking, we mimic, and that's how we learn. So babies try to copy their parents walking. They try to mimic the sounds that we're making. And so that's how they learn. And the thing is as well, like we are a product of our history. So no two people are going to make the same choices or the same word choices or the same punctuation choices in any one sentence. That's just how you can say to people, you can take a writing class and say to them, describe this tree, and you will not get two identical descriptions, right? And that's the whole point. The difference is between plagiarism and mimicry. Plagiarism is when somebody directly copies exactly what somebody else has done. Mimicry, though, is adopting, elements, tools, a feeling. And so I can give you an example. So Sally Thorne, who wrote The Hating Game, writes this sentence. He demonstrates throat, breast, ribs, hips. That's the quote. So in that context, it's a romantic sentence, right? I can't remember quite the context of it. But anyway, the point is it's in a romantic setting. And the way that's punctuated is he demonstrates full stop, throat full stop, breast full stop, ribs full stop, hips full stop. So it's like a word beat, like rhythm feel. It's very staccato. But you could take that tool and put it into a completely different context. So let's say you're in a horror story and you can have I freeze, full stop, blink, full stop, inhale, full stop, scream, full stop, run, full stop, right? So you have used exactly the same rhythm and you have mimicked the pacing of that sentence without actually using a single word that's the same. So you've mimicked without copying, and it's not plagiarism. And so this is the point of taking these tools out. If you like that word beat rhythm, then take the tool, but don't take the words, in that kind of construction. So yeah, I do think that mimicry gets a really bad rep, but actually that's not really what we're doing. By its kind of essence, imitation is iteration, because otherwise it's plagiarism.
It would be an interesting writing exercise to take that, the quote you read, and without changing any of it, make it into a horror context.
Yeah.
Not for publication, obviously, but just as a personal writing exercise, I thought, oh, that could be made pretty creepy.
Yeah. Yeah, but and this is what I love about it. You can literally take anything in any context and flip it into another one just by extracting the tool.
Yeah. So that was sort of an overview of the read step of the anatomy book. And how about deconstruct? I mean, we've talked about this a little bit in the context of reading, but you had some steps within that step that you recommended that you started out with as feel the feels. So can you talk a little bit about what you meant by feel the feels?
So what I tried to do was sort of show people how to go from, I have no idea what Sacha's blabbering on about, to doing this as unconsciously as I do it. So, if we're going to take it nice and slow, the first thing that you need to do is just notice when you feel something when you're reading. So, did you laugh? Did you smile? Did you swoon? Did you feel annoyed? Did you eye roll at a certain phrasing or something? And it's just to read the book slightly more consciously, right? So we're moving away from reading for escapism, not all the time. I always like to caveat, but just whilst we're doing these exercises, we're moving away from that kind of unconscious, I don't know about you, but when I read, my eyes kind of switch off and I just see it as a movie playing. But we're moving away from that. So the way to start making yourself conscious whilst you read is to start noticing when you feel emotions. And usually that's easy to do because they're a big spike of emotions. It's like a super romantic scene. It's a super scary scene. It's a super tense scene. So, you can almost feel your heart rate pounding. Once you've done that, the next thing to do is this is sacrilege. Everybody hates on me for doing this, but it is to mark up the book. I know, lots of us read library books. So, perhaps copy down the phrase or photocopy the page if you're not up for marking your physical pages. I used to do everything in pencil. Just got to the point where I just mark my books in pen now because it's so much easier and I can find exactly what I was trying to say. And I use sticky tabs as well, so I can find my place. But I can talk about that in a second. And then I write in the book all about why did that sentence catch my attention? What was it? Why did I feel something? Can I spot anything at very brief high level and go, oh, this was dialogue, or oh, this was a great metaphor, or oh, I loved this description. And so it's just to say, what is it that caught your attention? And if you know why, then put why. Then the next section is to do some analysis. So then you go into more depth and try to get very granular. So, for example, did they use a juxtaposition, but was that juxtaposition also a metaphor? Or did they use a juxtaposition, but actually it was descriptive, whereas on a previous page they'd done one that was emotive, right? What is it they're doing? Was the dialogue so voicey because of the word choice? Okay, well, what words did they choose to use? Why does that sound like a professor? Why does that sound like a gang member? Are they shortening words? Are they using slang language? What is it that they're doing at that sentence level? Have they played with punctuation like Sally Thorne did in that previous example? So you start to pull out the things that they've done. And quite often, I am not some kind of academic professor. I don't know all of the literary tools. I read The Elements of Style, I think it was, by Matt Forsyth. And there were so many things in there that I had picked up naturally, but didn't know the academic name for. And my point in this book is that it doesn't matter. You don't need to know the academic term. You just need to be able to call it a thing. And so I give an example of that. And I call a tool that I found that tangible, intangible, or is it intangible, tangible? One or the other. Anyway, see, it doesn't even matter, but I know what the tool is. And the tool is where you take something very intangible and you make it tangible through description. So it's something V.E. Schwab and Addie LaRue relate something intangible, which is this moment. Who can define what a moment is? As brief as a yawn. A moment as brief as a yawn. That's the quote. And so a moment is intangible. We cannot put any mass or reality on that until she relates it to something tangible. So we take the intangible and make it tangible. And the tangible is a yawn. We all know how long a yawn takes. And so I was like, oh my, this is amazing. And maybe that has a literary word or term. I don't know, but I don't care because I have a name and identified it. And so now I can use that tool of making something intangible tangible by relating it to something that we all recognize and are aware of. And so this is where you then start to get into that detail. You start to pull out those tools. The next thing is, just to develop awareness, which is more or less practice this until it becomes instinctive. And then the last two is to read every word. So just like it reading for escapism, I really caution people against skim reading. Of course, I skim read at times. I read quickly at times when I'm just binge reading just because I want the input. But I don't do that when I'm doing analysis because you can't. Because if you skip over words, you're going to miss the detail and the beauty in the prose. So yeah, read every word. And then the last bit is using a sticky tab system. So one of the things that I found is that after you've done this for, 20, 30, 40 books, you do start to forget like who said what, who's good at what. And so I basically label my sticky tabs different colors. So, for example, I'm making it up, but, yellow could be world building, blue could be dialogue, pink could be character, for example. And then at the end of having deconstructed a book, you can look down the spine at all of the different colors sticky tabs, and you'll know that somebody is very good at X, Y, or Z. And, maybe they're mostly yellow. So, that person's great at world building or whatever. And so then you can pick up a feeling for what people are good at if you read multiple books by these people. And then in future, if you want to improve on something, that's the author that you go to. So kind of like you develop a system around it. And also, if you want to go back and refer to a quote or refer to a line that was great and you want to pull that tool out, at least if you've got color-coded sticky notes that have meaning, consistent meaning, then you'll know, okay, well, it was a pink sticky note. So I've just got to look at the pink ones in this book. So it's sort of, doubly helpful.
Just a quick break from the interview. Are you getting value from the podcast? Please consider supporting it and all the work I do at the Indy Author by becoming a patron. To pledge a monthly contribution, go to patreon.com/the Indy Author, or to make an occasional contribution, perhaps to indicate the value that a specific episode or resource provided to you on your creative voyage, scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. And now, back to the interview. Yeah, I'm thinking of two experiences I had recently. Unfortunately, they were characterized by things I wouldn't want to do rather than things I would want to do. But one was a book I was reading where after a couple of instances of the primary character saying something sternly, he said sternly, blah, 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 he said sternly. And I started tabbing them because I was curious as to how often he was going to use he said sternly. And I said, the next time he says, I said sternly, I'm just stopping. And like 3 pages later, he did. So put the book aside because it was so distracting to me.
Oh, no.
And then the other example of that was I was reading a book that had, I have to say, the most egregious use of dialogue to convey information. And I'm making this up, but to illustrate, it was like, I went downstairs and saw my husband in the kitchen. Hello, Wade, I said. I see you were making your favorite coffee, Starbucks Extra Dark, that was given to you by your sister at Christmas when she came here from her home in Lancaster. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not very much. And the first time I tapped it, I thought, that's really weird. And I tapped it because I thought that I was going to want to talk about it with somebody. And then I realized she was doing it all the time. And so I started tabbing every time she did it. And there again, like it was one of these, if she does it one more time, I'm stopping. And she did so. But it wasn't as good as the tabs because that would have been interesting to see. But it was interesting to kind of glance through the dog-eared pages and see the clumps of she was doing it. It was instructive.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. You can learn just as much from what you don't like as from what you what you do like. Yeah, absolutely. I do the same.
And it made me realize, there's certain phrases that I know I overuse. Like my characters always sigh way more than any character really needs to sigh. And it's just another reminder to me that, before I finalize the manuscript, just search for the word sigh. And there's some reasonable number of times people can sigh, but try not to go overboard with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there was an item that was kind of, I thought, a bridge between the deconstruct advice and the implement advice. And that was other sources that people can deconstruct. Like it doesn't necessarily have to be only like novels if you're a novelist, or short stories if you're a short story writer. Can you talk a little bit about that, about what people can learn from different kinds of content?
Yeah. So, I mean, it kind of relates to what I was saying about sticky tabbying and then, looking at the colors of the tabs on a particular author's books. Like, what is it that you want to learn? Do you want to be more lyrical in your prose, even though you're a novelist? Well, then maybe you should read poetry, or maybe you should read, I don't know, short stories, because short stories have to pack a punch in a very few amount of words. Or maybe you want to be more concise, therefore read short stories or even flash fiction. But there are, we do so many things as authors that use words that isn't writing the book. So we write emails, for example, to our mailing list. Well, how many mailing lists are you subscribed to? Have you ever deconstructed what other authors are doing in their mailing list? Have you ever deconstructed the subject lines? There are so many different places. Song lyrics, TV dialogue, for example. Quite often I will sit at night, if we ever watch a TV show, and I will write down and make my wife rewind a show so that I can note down the precise dialogue that was spoken, because the dialogue is great. The TV shows in particular tell so much through, well, not tell, but show so much through dialogue, that it's a great place to deconstruct, the phrasing, the tone, the subtext in dialogue. But again, like film as well, sales copy, even if you want to get better at writing blurbs, then deconstruct sales copy. So there's just absolutely loads of places that you can find sources. Anything with words on it, even advertising copy on the back of milk cartons, for example.
Well, the thing that reminds me of is a couple of years ago, there was one of these tearjerker Christmas commercials where a young woman or a young man had found their granddad's old car or something like that. And they were restoring the car, and then they do the reveal, and, the grandfather's all choked up. I'll do some research and find out what this is so people can watch it. And it was stunning in the way it used no dialogue at all to tell the story. And then at the end, there was this brief bit of dialogue with, the grandchild and the grandfather engaged in some dialogue. And I was like, no, you shouldn't have gone there, because it was almost like they thought, what if people don't really understand what's going on here? Let's add a little bit of dialogue just in case they need to be caught up. And I'm like, no, like that was perfect storytelling without any dialogue. You should have just stopped before the dialogue. But it's just as you're saying, it was fascinating to think, well, are there places where I'm using dialogue as a crutch, like that person whose book I was describing before, when what the characters are doing is so much more impactful and engaging than what the characters might say to each other?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you talk about dialogue. I actually started a book last night by, what's it called? It's called A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik, who's an incredible award-winning author. And the first 6 to 8 pages was so good that I didn't think I was ever going to get past them, because I was like scrawling loads and loads and loads. Another 6 pages on, I put the book down. And the reason is because there was like no dialogue. It was just dense pages of prose. And here's the thing, it's really voicey, right? So the character's very interesting. But for me, for somebody who really likes pacey books, I was just like, where's the interaction? Where's the, there was so much kind of like, narrative kind of opinion that actually it was too much. And so I've decided to read it in audio, because I think because it's a voicey character, it will come across a lot better in audio. But, there again, that's the opposite. And it's the lack of dialogue that actually stopped me reading. So I think it's so interesting. And like, this is another thing to look at in terms of your genre. Like, what are the genre expectations? Like, what are the most common styles in your genre? And are you adhering to that and delivering what the reader wants? Like, because that, I don't think, adhered to the genre expectations, or it didn't adhere to mine anyway.
Well, one nice thing about having those sort of discrete chunks of content is that it would be interesting to give that book to someone and say, read the first 12 pages or however far you got, and then let's have a conversation about what you thought about that.
Yeah.
Because sometimes that's hard to do. Like, did you read this book? Did you like it? And by that time, the person has no idea and doesn't remember anymore. But if you have little chunks like that, that can make a nice grist for the mill of topic with a fellow writer.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
So I wanted to move on to the third step, which is implement. And one of the quotes was that you want your approach to be purposeful, focused, and intentional. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So really, this comes down to asking yourself, what is your goal? And we all say that we want one thing, and actually I think we want the other thing. So, and those things are either writing the best book that we can or selling loads of books. And picking one doesn't mean that you can't have the other. It's just that selling a lot of books requires you to deliver to the center of market, and also be very good at marketing. And that is very different to writing what you determine. I have to be very careful because I can upset a lot of people here. So, like, here's the thing. Okay. If you love books that are center market and you want to sell a lot of books, great. You're really aligned. Yeah. Like some people, let's say you want to write heterosexual fantasy romance. Great. You will probably sell a lot of books if you can deliver the correct tropes, the correct style, the correct length of book with the correct cover and the correct ad copy. And, all of these things adding up to delivering to center market, because it's much more complicated than just, I'm going to add enemies to lovers as a trope. But some people are like, well, I want to write about this nomadic plant who has a personality and a habit of smoking diamonds and, oh, God knows, I'm just making it up. This really non-central, very quirky, nuanced story. And they want the best prose and they want beautiful description and they want it pacey. And all of these things, which basically mean that you aren't going to be delivering what the center market wants. Now, when you say you want to write the best book you can, that's very vague. What does best look like? Because your deconstruction should be guiding that. So let's say you want to write something that's going to win the Nebula or the Locust, so some kind of fantasy award. How many of those fantasy books have you read? Because that's really the question here. That's where you should be focusing your deconstruction, not on Kindle Unlimited's, top 10 fantasy romance books, because they're very unlikely to win a Locust because they're very different in style, in length, in depth of world building, in depth of description, right? Like, so the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin has won the Locust and the Nebula. If you put that next to K.F. Breen, for example, they're very, very different books. And so what I'm talking about is that you have to decide what your goal is so that you can do the right deconstruction. If you want to sell a lot of books, then you should be reading the books that are selling a lot. Like, rather than reading, your young adult steampunk science fiction romance novel.
Yeah.
So align your deconstruction to whatever your goal is. Yeah. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense, especially because before we started recording, we were kind of talking about some of the challenges I'm facing writing a book that has paranormal and supernatural elements, but maybe not enough paranormal and supernatural elements to appeal to the hardcore paranormal supernatural reader. So yeah, that's just an ongoing struggle that I have to know.
Well, and here's the thing, right? You can always point at anomalies. So you can always point to people who are doing something really quirky and doing it very well, and they've made a massive audience and they sell a lot of books. You can, because there are always going to be exceptions to every single rule. The problem is that we all think that we're the exception to the rule. And I'm not saying that you think you're the exception to the rule. I'm just saying we as a collective, we all want to be special. And the problem is that most people who can do that successfully typically have a huge backlist. So what I always say to people is, if you want to write your quirky stuff, build your backlist by delivering to market first. Build your audience by delivering to market first, because then you have an audience who trusts you and will be more likely to give your slightly off center slightly quirky books a go. But if you don't have that trust built with your audience, why are they going to take a chance on a book that doesn't sound like exactly what they want to read? They're not going to do that. And so if you look at people like Katie Robert, for example, she has built huge success with writing kind of dark romance, a lot of straight stuff, mafia stuff. And then she started branching out into, poly relationships, queer relationships, male, sapphic, like different, types of series that are slightly more taboo or, anyway. So the point is you can absolutely do it, but the easiest way to do it is to do it once you have built and established an audience. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe everybody's turned off because they're horrified by everything I'm saying.
Well, an angle on this that I hadn't thought of before, or an angle on my situation that I hadn't thought of before, is that I think that my Lizzie Ballard series is more center positioned, or however you were describing it, than the Ann Kinnear one. And so maybe there's an opportunity there for me to find that readership like you're talking about. Like, I've always thought of the Ann Kinnear series as kind of my flagship series just because it was my first one. But my Lizzie Ballard series might be a better one to establish that kind of readership with, because it is meeting the tropes in a more expected way, surprising yet inevitable. And then I think that the Ann Kinnear books are similar enough that if people liked the Lizzie Ballard books and they were brought in because they were meeting all the tropes, then they'd be more willing to give the Ann Kinnear books a try.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I kind of rolled with the punches.
Yeah, no. And the thing is as well, is that if you can do that analysis before you start writing and bake it into the book, it makes marketing that book so much easier. Like, I really struggled to talk about my first series because I can't really tell you what it's about. It's kind of, about fate and destiny, and it's sort of portal fantasy, but it's not really. And, it's sort of forbidden romance, but kind of not. And, so I don't think I could even give you a description. Whereas if you look at the Ruby Rose stuff, I literally baked the marketing in before I started. Ruby Rose's first book, A Game of Hearts and Heist, is a sapphic enemies to lovers heist story with found family. Everybody knows what to expect. And that's the point, right? When you do that and you bake it in and you kind of understand the language, like I always talk about, everybody hates talking about tropes, but actually that is the language that readers communicate in. When you go into these massive Facebook groups, everyone's like, I want Grumpy Sunshine set in Europe. And everybody knows what to suggest and what to recommend. Authors need to get comfortable talking in the language that readers talk in to promote and market your books. Because otherwise, it's like you speaking Swahili to a reader who's speaking Spanish, Yeah. But the easiest way to do that is to bake it in at the beginning before you even put a single word on the page.
Yeah, I think it's a good, knowing that many of my listeners are going to still be working on their first book. I'd almost hate to leave them with the idea that, you better stop now and figure out your marketing plan, because I think it's so important to just get the book written. But if you're writing the book of your heart, then just realize that if when you're done, it's not meeting the conventions that can make it easily shelved in a particular genre, then you're going to have to adjust your sales expectations accordingly. But not that you need to. Pardon?
I wrote 4. I did it 4 times, not to market. So don't worry, listeners. It's fine. You can start again. I did it 4 times, wrote a whole series that was completely off center, and then figured out how to do it. So don't worry. You're fine. Just write. And the thing is, getting a book finished, it teaches you so much. It's really, really, really necessary to just get the first one done.
Yeah. Well, Sacha, thank you so much. That, I think, is not only going to be hugely helpful for the listeners, but it's hugely helpful for me too, as I continue to think through my own publishing plan for my own books. So please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Okay, so sachablack.co.uk, Sacha with a C, so SACHA, the colour black.co.uk. Rebel Author Podcast, you can find me on Instagram at Sacha Black Author, or you can find me on TikTok as Ruby Roe, and it's ROE. Or you can find my more on-center books under Ruby Roe.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.